You're telling me these humans just responded to a general distress beacon? Without verification? Without diplomatic clearance? Without even knowing who sent it? First Communications Officer Zixtel's facial tentacles writhed in disbelief as he stared at the sensor readings. Not just responded, Second Officer Marika drawled, her own bioluminescent patches flickering with barely contained amusement. They sent their entire 7th Fleet. Apparently the humans have this thing called the Good Samaritan Law, hardwired into their cultural DNA or something. The massive holographic display dominating the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Center showed the impossible. Nearly 50 warships of human design dropping out of FTL in perfect formation around the distressed Arxian merchant vessel. The Arxians, being a species of generally peaceful spacefaring merchants, had never even met humans before. This was about to be one hell of a first contact situation. Should we warn the Arxians? Zixtel's tentacles were now tied in actual knots, a sure sign of extreme anxiety among his species. Marika just laughed, her bioluminescence creating patterns that roughly translated to, "This is going to be hilarious," in at least 3 different galactic standard languages. Warn them about what? That the most notorious Deathworlders in the galaxy are coming to help them? That humans consider leaves no one behind to be not just a motto but a sacred obligation? Or that they're about to experience what humans call aggressive assistance? The situation had started simply enough. The Arxian vessel Profitable Venture had suffered a catastrophic engine failure while traversing a particularly empty sector of space. Following standard protocol, they had activated their distress beacon and settled in for the expected 3 to 4 standard cycles it would take for the nearest Galactic Council rescue vessel to reach them. What they hadn't counted on was that their distress signal would be picked up by the human Space Force vessel, USS Ubuntu. Humans had a peculiar habit of naming their ships after ancient Earth concepts, which had been conducting routine patrol duties just 2 sectors over. The Ubuntu's captain, one James Rodriguez, had apparently taken one look at the distress signal and decided that the only reasonable response was to call in the entire 7th Fleet. "The humans are hailing the Arxian vessel," one of the junior officers reported, their crystalline form vibrating with excitement. The communication that followed would later become required viewing at the Galactic Council's Academy of Xenodiplomacy, though not necessarily for the reasons one might expect. "Arxian vessel, this is Captain Rodriguez of the Human Space Force. We noticed you were having a bad day. We brought some friends to help fix that." The response from the Arxian captain was predictably confused. "Human vessel, we appreciate your concern, but we have already contacted Galactic Council Emergency Services." "Oh, we know," Rodriguez interrupted cheerfully. "We sent them a message too. Something along the lines of, 'Don't worry, we got this.' Now, our engineers are practically vibrating with excitement at the chance to look at your engine systems. Fair warning, they might try to improve them while they're fixing them. We have a hard time just leaving things at good enough." The next few hours were a master class in what the galaxy would come to know as typical human behavior. The 7th Fleet's engineering teams, practically giddy with the opportunity to examine previously unknown technology, not only fixed the Arxian engine but managed to improve its efficiency by roughly 47%. They also left detailed maintenance manuals, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and what they called helpful doodles. Meanwhile, the fleet's medical teams insisted on conducting routine health checks on the Arxian crew. Just to be safe, the logistics department practically forced upon them 6 months' worth of emergency supplies just in case. And the cultural exchange officers began what would become a 3-hour conversation about the similarities between Arxian trading practices and something called Wall Street. Are they teaching the Arxians how to play something called poker?" Zixtel asked, watching the various video feeds with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Apparently it's traditional," Marika replied, not even trying to hide her amusement anymore. "Just wait until they break out something called space shanties. I heard about those from the Regelian delegation. Apparently humans insist that all space rescue operations must be accompanied by traditional singing." True to form, it wasn't long before the communications channels were filled with the sound of hundreds of human voices singing about what they called ancient sailors, and something called a drunken whaler. The Arxians, to their credit, were trying their best to learn the choruses. The situation reached its peak when Captain Rodriguez formally invited the Arxian captain to something called a "Thank God You're Not Dead" dinner party aboard the Ubuntu. The invitation, transmitted across all channels and therefore recorded for posterity in the Galactic Council's archives, included the phrase, "Bring your crew, We're making space tacos. They do realize that this is going to completely revolutionize our emergency response protocols, don't they? Zixtel had finally given up on maintaining any semblance of professional detachment and was watching the proceedings with the same fascination one might observe a solar system forming. Oh, it's worse than that, Marika said, pulling up another set of data streams. Look at these readings. The Arxians are already incorporating human engineering suggestions into their systems. Their engine efficiency is now well above Galactic Council standards. And are those humans teaching them how to modify their shields? Technically, a new voice cut in. We're teaching them how to modify their shields while also explaining the concept of redundant systems and something we call Murphy's Law. The human liaison officer, Lieutenant Maxwell Thompson, had entered the emergency response center so quietly that neither Zixtel nor Marika had noticed. He was grinning in that peculiar way humans had, showing far too many teeth to be comfortable for most species. Murphy's Law? Zixtel asked, immediately regretting the question. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Thompson quoted cheerfully. It's why we believe in backup systems for our backup systems, and why the 7th Fleet carries enough spare parts to basically build a new ship from scratch. Speaking of which, you might want to update your records. The Arxians are probably going to start implementing similar policies. The aftermath of what would become known as the Ubuntu incident would have far-reaching consequences throughout the galaxy. The Arxians, far from being traumatized by their experience with human aggressive assistance, became some of humanity's strongest advocates in the Galactic Council. They also began incorporating various human practices into their own operations, including the installation of what they called just-in-case systems and the tradition of singing during rescue operations. The Galactic Council, meanwhile, found itself dealing with a flood of requests from various species asking to establish trade relations with humans, particularly in the fields of engineering and emergency response. There were also numerous inquiries about these space tacos and something called poker nights. Perhaps most significantly, the incident led to the creation of a new Galactic Council regulation, officially titled Protocol 7H, Guidelines for Human Emergency Response Integration, but more commonly known as the Yes, They're Always Like This protocol. You know what the really interesting part is? Thompson said, still grinning as they watched the Arxian vessel successfully test its newly upgraded engines. This isn't even the most over-the-top rescue operation we've mounted. Wait until you hear about the time we sent 3 fleets to help a stranded colony ship because, and I quote, it looked like they could use a hand. Zixtel's tentacles threatened to tie themselves into quantum knots. 3 fleets? For 1 colony ship? Well, yeah, Thompson shrugged. It was a big ship, had families on it. You know how we get about kids being in trouble. His expression turned thoughtful. Though I suppose we should mention that the card games are optional. Some species have trouble holding the cards with their appendages. Marika's bioluminescence had shifted to patterns that typically indicated either extreme amusement or an impending nervous breakdown. I'm starting to understand why the humans section of the emergency response manual is 3 times longer than everyone else's. Oh, that reminds me, Thompson added brightly. We're submitting some updates to that manual. We've got some great ideas about improving response times using what we call the better to ask forgiveness than permission approach to jurisdictional boundaries. As if to punctuate his statement, another transmission came through from the Ubuntu. Hey, while we're here, we noticed that your local sensor array could use some upgrading. Don't worry, we brought spare parts for that too. Anyone interested in learning about redundant power systems? The Arxians' enthusiastic response was almost drowned out by the sound of what appeared to be the entire 7th Fleet breaking into another chorus of space shanties. Zixtel looked at the mounting pile of incident reports on his terminal, then at the continuing celebration on the main display. And finally at Thompson's unwavering grin. You're not going to stop, are you? This is just how humans are. Pretty much, Thompson agreed cheerfully. Though you might want to prepare yourself. Once word gets out about how this rescue went, other species might start specifically requesting human assistance. We've got a whole fleet of ships just waiting for the chance to help. We call it aggressive friendship. Aggressive friendship, Zixtel repeated weakly. Yep. Thompson's grin impossibly grew even wider. Just wait until they learn about our tradition of rescue party potlucks. Speaking of which, you both should come to the next one. We're thinking of making it a regular thing. Every 3rd solar cycle, bring a dish from your homeworld. We're calling it Interstellar Emergency Response Social Hour. As Marika and Zixtel watched Thompson leave, presumably to coordinate more aggressive friendship initiatives. The main display showed the Archean vessel successfully entering FTL, now equipped with enough upgrades and spare parts to qualify as practically a new ship. The last transmission from the merchant vessel, broadcast on all frequencies, was a somewhat shaky but enthusiastic rendition of, "What do you do with a drunken spacer?" "You know," Marika said finally, her bioluminescence settling into patterns of resigned acceptance. "I think the galaxy might actually be better off for this." Zixtel, watching as the last of the human ships prepared to return to their patrol routes, couldn't help but agree. His tentacles had finally unknotted themselves, and he found himself humming what he thought might be the chorus of one of those space shanties. "Though," he added, "perhaps we should update the emergency response protocols to include a warning about the singing, and the card games, and the, what did they call them, space tacos?" "Too late," Marika laughed, pulling up a new set of transmissions. "The Archeans are already spreading the word. Apparently they're organizing what they're calling a gratitude poker tournament next standard cycle. They've invited the entire 7th Fleet. "Of course they are," Zixtel sighed, but there was a note of fondness in his voice. "You know, I think I might actually be looking forward to that potluck." In the vast expanse of space, the legend of the Ubuntu incident would live on, a testament to humanity's unique approach to emergency response and their unflagging determination to turn every rescue operation into what they called a chance to make new friends. The fact that these new friends often ended up with significantly upgraded technology, a working knowledge of poker, and an inexplicable appreciation for space shanties was, as the humans would say, just a bonus. And if the number of distress calls specifically requesting human assistance increased dramatically in the following cycles, well, that was just the galaxy adapting to humanity's particular brand of aggressive helpfulness. After all, as Captain Rodriguez would later write in his official report, in space, everyone could use a friend, preferably one with spare parts, space tacos, and a really good singing voice. "You've got to be kidding me," Lieutenant Thompson said, staring at the holographic display in the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Center. "They actually made a training manual?" First Communications Officer Zixtel's tentacles curled with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. Not just any training manual. The Archeans compiled what they call the Comprehensive Guide to Human-Style Emergency Response Protocols. It's already become the most requested document in the Council's database. The manual's cover, projected in shimmering detail above them, featured an artistic rendering of the USS Ubuntu alongside an Archean merchant vessel, with musical notes and playing cards floating in the space between them. Somehow they'd even managed to include a detailed diagram of what appeared to be a space taco. "Look at Chapter 3, Marika suggested, her bioluminescent pattern spelling out what roughly translated to, "You're going to love this," in at least 5 different dialects. Thompson's eyes widened as he read the chapter title. Understanding Human Response Scaling, Why One Ship Means 50, and Other Important Mathematical Conversions. "They've actually created a formula," Zixtel explained, pulling up a detailed mathematical equation. "It correlates the severity of the emergency with the likely number of human vessels that will respond, factoring in variables like presence of civilians, distance from nearest human port, and something they're calling the aw heck factor." The aftermath of the Ubuntu incident had evolved in ways that no one, possibly not even the humans, had anticipated. The Archeans' Gratitude Poker Tournament had somehow morphed into a quarterly interstellar emergency response convention, complete with workshops on shield modification, classes on Earth musical history, and what was now the largest multi-species potluck in known space. "Have you seen the latest addition to the Galactic Council's emergency response frequencies?" Marika asked, pulling up another display. "They've added a dedicated channel just for human space shanties. Apparently, some species have started using them as a way to gauge distance to the nearest human rescue fleet. The louder the singing, the closer the help." Thompson couldn't help but laugh. "Well, that's one way to use our tendency to harmonize during rescue operations. Though I have to ask, did they really need to include an entire appendix on proper poker etiquette?" "Actually," a new voice chimed in, "that was my contribution." Captain Rodriguez of the Ubuntu strode into the Emergency Response Center, looking exactly as pleased with himself as one might expect. "Figured if we're going to spread our particular brand of emergency response throughout the galaxy, we might as well make sure everyone knows how to call a bluff properly." The Ubuntu had become something of a legend in the intervening cycles. Its crew had somehow managed to turn their patrol route into what they called a traveling emergency response workshop, complete with impromptu engineering seminars and what Rodriguez insisted on calling interactive cultural exchange exercises, but everyone else recognized as glorified party planning sessions. "Oh, show them the statistics," Zixtel said, his tentacles practically vibrating with excitement. "The ones about response time improvement?" The numbers were, to use a human phrase, mind-boggling. Since the implementation of what was now officially known as the Human Assistance Integration Protocol, though most species still called it the "yes, they're always like this" protocol, average emergency response times across the galaxy had decreased by 73%. Equipment failure rates had dropped by 82%, and perhaps most surprisingly, incidents of space piracy had decreased by a staggering 91%. "Turns out," Rodriguez explained with a grin, "pirates aren't too keen on operating in sectors where there's a high probability of running into a human rescue fleet. Something about us being criminally enthusiastic about helping people and disturbingly well-armed for a bunch of good Samaritans." "Don't forget about the engineering revolution," Marika added. Her bioluminescence had taken on patterns that the environmental systems were having trouble processing, possibly due to the sheer amount of amusement she was expressing. "The Arxians' upgraded engine designs have already been adopted by 17 different species. They're calling it the Ubuntu standard." "Speaking of standards," Thompson interjected, "have you seen the latest modifications to the emergency supply loadout requirements? Someone convinced the Council to mandate that all rescue vessels carry what they're calling a minimum acceptable quantity of recreational equipment." "Let me guess," Rodriguez said. "Poker cards, musical instruments, and cooking supplies?" "And a fully stocked entertainment database," Zixtel confirmed, "though I'm still not entirely clear on why the human section insists on including something called karaoke standards." The conversation was interrupted by a new alert on the main display. A Rigelian science vessel had reported engine troubles in a nearby sector. Before anyone could react, no fewer than 3 human rescue ships had already acknowledged the signal and were en route. The communications channel was already filling with the opening verses of "1,000 Ships in the Night." "Should we tell them that's not actually a traditional Earth sea shanty?" Thompson asked. "At this point," Rodriguez shrugged, "I'm pretty sure it counts. The Rigelians helped write it after all. Something about the harmonics matching their natural resonance frequencies." The impact of humanity's approach to emergency response had extended far beyond mere technical improvements. The quarterly emergency response conventions had evolved into major diplomatic events, with species that had previously barely acknowledged each other's existence now regularly collaborating on what they called innovative rescue scenarios, but what amounted to increasingly elaborate excuses to throw interstellar parties. "Have you seen the latest addition to the training simulations?" Marika asked, pulling up yet another file. "The Arxians insisted on including a module on proper potluck etiquette. There's an entire section dedicated to something called ensuring adequate dessert diversity." "That was actually a significant diplomatic breakthrough," Rodriguez pointed out. "You'd be surprised how many potential interspecies incidents have been avoided by having clear guidelines about dessert sharing protocols." The conversation was interrupted again, this time by a massive data transfer from the Arxian Merchants Guild. They had apparently compiled a comprehensive database of what they called emergency response success celebrations across known space, complete with recordings of various species' attempts at Earth songs, recipes for adapted versions of space tacos, and what appeared to be an increasingly complex set of multi-species card game variants. "Is that poker played with telepathic cards for non-corporeal species?" Thompson asked, squinting at one particular entry. "Oh yeah," Rodriguez nodded. "The energy beings from the Carina Nebula came up with that one. They're surprisingly good at bluffing for entities that exist as pure thought." Zixtel's tentacles had formed what humans had learned to recognize as their equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "You know, when we first encountered humans, we thought your tendency to over-respond to emergencies was going to be a problem, but somehow you've managed to turn it into the galaxy's most effective diplomatic program?" Marika suggested. "I was going to say the most elaborate excuse for an ongoing interstellar party," Zixtel corrected. "But yes, that too." The tactical display lit up again as the Rigelian science vessel reported successful repairs, ahead of schedule thanks to what they described as enthusiastic human assistance. The accompanying message included an invitation to what they were calling an impromptu recognition of service excellence gathering. "They mean party," Thompson translated unnecessarily. "Of course they do," Rodriguez grinned. "You know, I'm starting to think we might have accidentally created something important here," Not just the improved emergency response protocols or the technical innovations, but a way for different species to connect? Marika suggested, her bioluminescence creating patterns that somehow managed to convey both amusement and sincerity. Exactly. Though I have to ask, did anyone expect that our approach to space rescue would end up creating the galaxy's most successful social network? The answer, of course, was no. No one had expected the combination of human enthusiasm, Arxian organizational skills, and the general galaxy's newfound appreciation for poker nights to result in what was rapidly becoming the most effective form of interstellar cooperation anyone had ever seen. The real question, Zixtel mused, his tentacles forming patterns that the automated translator struggled to keep up with, is what happens next. The Seventh Fleet's approach has already transformed emergency response across known space. What other aspects of galactic society are humans going to revolutionize with their particular brand of aggressive helpfulness? The answer to that question would have to wait, however, as the emergency channels lit up with another distress call. This time it was a Centaurian mining operation reporting life support issues. The response was immediate and, by now, entirely predictable. Multiple human ships altering course, offers of assistance flooding in from nearby vessels of various species, and the familiar opening chords of what had become known as the Universal Rescue Orchestra, filling the communications channels. "Well," Rodriguez said, already heading for the door, "shall we show them how we do things Ubuntu style?" The others followed, Zixtel humming what sounded suspiciously like "What do you do with a drunken spacer?" under his breath. After all, there were people who needed help, ships that needed fixing, and an ever-growing collection of space shanties that needed singing. Just another day in the post-Ubuntu galaxy, where every emergency was an opportunity for what humans called making friends the exciting way, and where the sound of approaching rescue ships was invariably accompanied by the sweet strains of interstellar harmony. And if the Galactic Council's emergency response protocols now included official guidelines for proper celebration of successful assistance rendering, well, that was just proof that sometimes the best way to unite a galaxy was through a combination of aggressive helpfulness, questionable singing, and the occasional hand of poker. After all, as the newly updated Galactic Emergency Response Manual stated in its introduction, in space, everyone can hear you sing, especially if you're human, because they really don't know how to do anything quietly. The Galactic Council's annual Emergency Response Summit was in full swing, and for once, it wasn't just because of the humans singing. Though, admittedly, there was still plenty of that. "I still can't believe they made it an official requirement," Lieutenant Thompson said, watching as a mixed group of Arxians, Rigelians, and humans led what appeared to be a galaxy-wide singing lesson. The main conference hall of the Galactic Council's central station was packed with representatives from over 300 species, all attempting to learn the chorus of the Quantum Engine's Lament. "The singing?" First Communications Officer Zixtel asked, his tentacles swaying in time with the music. "Or the fact that the Council officially recognized aggressive helpfulness as a legitimate diplomatic strategy?" "Both," Thompson admitted, "though I'm more surprised about the latter, especially after what happened in the Carina Nebula last month." The Carina incident, as it had come to be known, had started innocently enough. A group of energy beings had reported unusual fluctuations in their quantum substrate. Within hours, the human response fleet had arrived with what they called experimental quantum harmonization equipment, but what everyone else recognized as heavily modified musical instruments. The solution, as it turned out, involved creating a multidimensional harmony using a combination of traditional Earth instruments, Rigelian resonance chambers, and what the humans insisted on calling space bagpipes. The resulting performance not only stabilized the quantum substrate, but also created what the energy beings described as the most aesthetically pleasing dimensional resonance in recorded history. "You have to admit," Marika chimed in, her bioluminescence creating patterns that somehow managed to convey both amusement and pride. "It was a uniquely human solution to the problem. Who else would think to solve quantum instability with a concert?" "Speaking of unique solutions," Captain Rodriguez said, joining their small group with a datapad in hand, "have you seen the latest additions to the emergency response training program?" The program had evolved considerably since its inception. What had started as a simple guide to human-style emergency response had grown into a comprehensive curriculum that included everything from advanced engineering principles to what was now officially called interspecies social dynamics in crisis situations. But what everyone knew was really how to party like a human while fixing things. "I particularly enjoy the new simulation scenarios," Zixtel said, his tentacles forming what humans had learned to recognize as their equivalent of a grin. Especially the one titled, "So You've Accidentally Upgraded an Entire Civilization, a Guide to Post-Contact Integration." That particular scenario had been added after an incident involving a pre-FTL civilization, 3 human rescue ships, and what the official report described as an enthusiastic exchange of technological and culinary knowledge. The civilization in question had achieved faster-than-light travel roughly 2 standard cycles ahead of schedule, primarily because, as one human engineer put it, their food was amazing, and we wanted to make sure they could deliver anywhere in the galaxy. "Don't forget about the Diplomatic Corps' new initiative," Marika added, pulling up another holographic display. "They're calling it Proactive Peace Through Preparedness, but everyone knows it's just an excuse to spread the Ubuntu approach to more aspects of galactic society." The initiative had already led to some interesting developments. The Galactic Council's traditionally staid diplomatic functions had been transformed into what one human ambassador described as networking opportunities with better food and emergency repair workshops. Several traditionally isolationist species had even begun participating, apparently drawn by the combination of practical knowledge exchange and what they called intriguing human social customs. "Have you heard about the latest modification to the Universal Translator protocols?" Thompson asked, trying and failing to suppress a grin. "They've added a special subroutine just for translating what they're calling emergency response enthusiasm levels. The new system could apparently distinguish between various levels of human excitement, ranging from standard rescue operation enthusiastic to potentially system-altering levels of helpful. It had proved particularly useful in helping other species prepare for the appropriate scale of human response to any given situation. "Oh, that reminds me," Rodriguez said, checking his datapad again. "The Arxians have finished their analysis of the economic impact of human-style emergency response protocols. The results are interesting." "Interesting how?" Zixtel asked, his tentacles curling with curiosity. "Well, for one thing, the implementation of what they're calling the Ubuntu economic model has led to a 300% increase in interspecies trade agreements. Apparently, nothing facilitates commerce quite like the combination of reliable emergency assistance and regular poker tournaments. The economic transformation had been one of the more unexpected consequences of humanity's influence on galactic emergency response protocols. The practice of combining rescue operations with social gatherings had created numerous opportunities for informal trade negotiations, while the human tendency to fix things better than they were before had led to a galaxy-wide renaissance in technological innovation. "The really fascinating part," Marika noted, her bioluminescence creating patterns that the translator rendered as amusement with a side of vindication, "is how many species have adopted human-style redundancy protocols in their commercial operations. The Arxians are calling it the backup revolution." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main stage. A group of Centaurian engineers was demonstrating what they called emergency repair shanties, a fusion of traditional human space songs with Centaurian mathematical harmonics. The resulting music was not only surprisingly pleasant, but also contained encoded repair instructions for various types of spacecraft systems. "Now that," Thompson said, watching as more species joined the demonstration, "is exactly the kind of innovation we were hoping for when we started this whole thing." "When we started this whole thing?" Zixtel's tentacles formed patterns of skepticism. "As I recall, you humans didn't actually plan any of this. You just showed up with an entire fleet to help one merchant vessel, and somehow accidentally created a galaxy-wide cultural revolution. That's the best kind of revolution," Rodriguez grinned. "The unplanned ones that work out better than anyone could have imagined." The summit continued around them, a testament to how much the galaxy had changed in the cycles since the Ubuntu incident. In one corner, a group of traditionally warlike species was engaged in what they called competitive emergency response planning, but what looked suspiciously like a friendly competition to see who could design the most elaborate rescue operation. In another, representatives from various spacefaring races were participating in what had become known as multi-species engineering jam sessions. "You know what the really amazing part is?" Marika said, watching as a particularly enthusiastic group attempted to combine Rigelian quantum harmonics with what appeared to be a human conga line. None of this was in any of our predictive models for galactic development. We had scenarios for first contact, for technological exchange, for cultural integration. But nobody ever predicted that the key to galactic unity would be humans being, well, aggressively human about helping people. Speaking of helping people, Thompson interjected, checking his own datapad. We just received a rather interesting distress call from the Andromeda Galaxy. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. The Andromeda Galaxy? Zixtel's tentacles tied themselves in knots. But that's millions of light years away. We don't even have regular contact with them yet. Well, Rodriguez said, his grin growing wider. I suppose it's time to test out those new long-range rescue protocols we've been developing. Anyone up for making first contact Ubuntu style? The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Representatives from dozens of species began volunteering ships, resources, and personnel. The Arxians immediately started organizing what they called a preliminary cross-galactic assistance planning session. But what everyone knew would turn into the biggest poker tournament in history. The Rigelians offered their latest quantum harmonization technology, while the Centaurians began composing what they claimed would be the first intergalactic space shanty. As the summit transformed into an impromptu planning session for humanity's first cross-galactic rescue operation, Zixtel looked at his friends and colleagues with what could only be described as resigned acceptance. We're really doing this, aren't we? He asked. We're going to make first contact with Andromeda by showing up with a multi-species rescue fleet, quantum-harmonized space shanties, and probably enough spare parts to rebuild their entire civilization? Of course we are, Thompson replied cheerfully. After all, what better way to introduce ourselves to a new galaxy than by offering to help fix things? Besides, Rodriguez added, already pulling up star charts and beginning to plot what would undoubtedly be the most ambitious rescue operation in history. Think of all the new poker variants we'll learn. And so, as the galaxy's first intergalactic emergency response fleet began to take shape, the sound of hundreds of voices singing 1,000 Ships in the Night echoed through the conference hall. The Ubuntu's legacy, it seemed, was about to go intergalactic. After all, as the newly updated Galactic Emergency Response Manual stated in its latest appendix, in an infinite universe, there are infinite opportunities to help. And if humans have taught us anything, it's that no distance is too far when someone needs assistance, especially if you can turn it into a party along the way. The Galactic Council's Emergency Response Center had never been so busy, or so loud. The massive holographic display that dominated the central chamber was currently tracking no fewer than 3,000 ships from 200 different species, all part of what had become known as Operation Good Neighbor, the Andromeda Initiative. You realize, Lieutenant Thompson said, watching as another fleet of mixed-species vessels jumped to FTL, that when we first responded to that Arxian distress beacon, none of us could have predicted this. First Communications Officer Zixtel's tentacles waved in what had become the universally recognized gesture for humans and their escalation protocols. The gesture had been officially added to the Galactic Standard Communication Manual 6 months ago, along with several other human-inspired emergency response signals. Predicted what specifically? He asked. The fact that we're mounting the largest cooperative rescue operation in known history. The development of new FTL technologies just to make it possible? Or the fact that we've somehow turned emergency response into the galaxy's most popular professional sport? Speaking of sports, Marika interjected, her bioluminescence creating patterns that the latest version of the Universal Translator rendered as amused but impressed. Have you seen the latest ratings for the Intergalactic Emergency Response League? The IERL had started as a joke, a way to track and compare the success rates of different rescue fleets. It had somehow evolved into a galaxy-wide phenomenon, complete with professional teams, sponsored events, and what humans called fantasy leagues. The most popular team, the Ubuntu Ultimates, was a mixed-species crew famous for their combination of human-style aggressive assistance and Arxian precision engineering. The real question, Captain Rodriguez said, joining them at the central console, is whether we're ready for what happens when we actually reach Andromeda. The advanced scouts are reporting some interesting findings. The preliminary data from the long-range probes had been fascinating. The Andromeda Galaxy, it seemed, had its own complex network of civilizations, complete with their own emergency response protocols. The distress signal they'd received had come from something they were calling the Andromedan Collective, a loose federation of species facing what appeared to be a galaxy-wide technical crisis. Well, Thompson grinned, we did want to make a good first impression. What better way than showing up with the largest multi-species rescue fleet ever assembled? The fleet was indeed impressive. At its core were the human vessels, led by the legendary USS Ubuntu herself. Surrounding them were ships from virtually every spacefaring race in the Milky Way, each contributing their own unique approaches to emergency response. The Arxians had brought their advanced engineering vessels, the Regellians their quantum harmonization ships, and the Centaurians their newly developed sonic repair cruisers. The really interesting part, Marika noted, pulling up another set of data streams, is how the different species have started combining their approaches. Look at this. The display showed what appeared to be a Regellian quantum harmonizer being used in conjunction with human repair drones and Arxian precision tools, all coordinated through a Centaurian sonic control system. The resulting hybrid technology was more effective than any single species approach had been alone. We're calling it convergent emergency response, Rodriguez explained. The theory is that by combining different species methods, we can create solutions that none of us would have thought of individually. Like using modified poker games to teach quantum mechanics, Zixtel asked dryly. Exactly, Thompson beamed. Though I still think the Schrodinger's full house variant needs some work. The cards can't be simultaneously there and not there and be a valid hand. The conversation was interrupted by a new alert from the advance fleet. They had made first contact with Andromedan vessels, and the initial exchanges were unexpected. Are they... Zixtel's tentacles twisted in confusion. Are they challenging us to something called a rescue-off? Oh, this is perfect, Rodriguez laughed. Apparently, they've developed their own competitive emergency response culture. They're suggesting a friendly competition to see whose methods are more effective. A rescue-off, Thompson mused. Well, we did bring the entire Intergalactic Emergency Response League championship team with us, and the runners-up, and basically everyone who's ever competed. Plus, Marika added, her bioluminescence creating patterns of pure mischief. We have our secret weapon. Space tacos? She confirmed, along with every other culinary innovation that's come out of our emergency response culture. The Andromedan Collective won't know what hit them. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as the fleet prepared for what was rapidly becoming the most elaborate first contact scenario in history. The Arxians were organizing what they called a preliminary cross-galactic assistance demonstration, but what everyone knew would be the biggest poker tournament ever held. The Regellians were fine-tuning their quantum harmonizers to account for Andromedan physics, while the Centaurians were composing what they claimed would be the first true intergalactic symphony. You know, Thompson said, watching as a group of human engineers taught their Andromedan counterparts the finer points of what they called percussive maintenance, while simultaneously introducing them to Earth music. I think we might have accidentally created something important here. Accidentally? Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. That's becoming our species' signature move, accidentally revolutionizing galactic society through aggressive helpfulness. The rescue-off itself turned out to be more of a collaboration than a competition. The Andromedans had developed their own unique approaches to emergency response, including something they called quantum empathy fields and temporal repair matrices. Within hours, teams from both galaxies were working together to combine their methods, creating new hybrid technologies that neither side had thought possible. They're already planning regular exchange programs, Marika reported, reviewing the latest diplomatic updates. The Andromedan Collective wants to establish permanent liaison offices in our galaxy, and vice versa. They're particularly interested in something they're calling human-style optimization protocols. You mean our tendency to fix things better than they were before? Thompson asked. That and our apparent ability to turn any crisis into an excuse for a party, Zixtel added. His tentacles had finally mastered the art of shuffling cards, a skill he'd never imagined would become crucial to his diplomatic career. The impact of the Andromeda Initiative was already rippling through both galaxies. The Andromedan Collective had immediately adopted several Milky Way emergency response practices, including the requirement for rescue ships to carry recreational equipment. In return, they had shared their own innovations, including a fascinating approach to crisis management that involved something similar to synchronized swimming in four-dimensional space. The really interesting part, Rodriguez said, reviewing the latest reports, is how quickly they've taken to our social customs. They've already organized their first poker tournament, and I hear they're developing their own versions of space shanties. Speaking of which, Thompson interjected, checking his datapad, you might want to see this. The main display lit up with a transmission from one of the advance fleet's ships. A mixed group of Milky Way and Andromedan species was attempting to perform What Do You Do with a Drunken Spacer, while incorporating quantum harmonics and temporal distortion effects. The result was either the most advanced piece of music ever created or the galaxy's first weaponized earworm. Possibly both. Well, Zixtel said, his tentacles swaying in what might have been time with the music. I suppose this means the Ubuntu's legacy has officially gone intergalactic. Legacy? Rodriguez grinned. This is just the beginning. Wait until they hear about our emergency response sports leagues. I have a feeling the next intergalactic championship is going to be a lot more interesting. As if to punctuate his statement, another alert came through. The Andromedan Collective had just formally proposed the establishment of what they were calling the Two Galaxies Cup, an emergency response competition that would bring together teams from both galaxies for what promised to be the most elaborate rescue operations ever attempted. You know what the best part is? Marika asked, her bioluminescence creating patterns that somehow managed to convey both amusement and pride. None of this was in any of our first contact protocols. We just showed up to help and somehow ended up creating an intergalactic cultural exchange program. That's humanity for you, Thompson laughed. We came, we saw, we helped fix things, and then we taught everyone how to play poker. I'd say that's a pretty good day's work. As the combined fleets continued their work, the sound of 2 galaxies' worth of emergency response teams singing together echoed through space. The Ubuntu's approach to helping others had not only transformed one galaxy, but was now reaching across the cosmic void to touch another. After all, as the newly updated Intergalactic Emergency Response Manual stated in its preface, in a universe of infinite possibilities, the most powerful force isn't gravity or dark energy. It's the simple act of showing up to help, preferably with spare parts, a deck of cards, and enough snacks to share with everyone you meet along the way, the end.